I just listened to every album by Queen, and here are my thoughts. So going in, I knew most of their hits, most of their most popular hits, the ones that show up on radio and movies and TV shows and things like that. I had a greatest hits Queen album, one of them. I think there's quite a few of them. I had one of them, and so I got pretty familiarized with them that way. But even then, I didn't know all their hits, and I didn't know any of their deep cuts. And like a lot of the other bands that I covered, this is one that started off strong and just stayed strong throughout their whole career. They didn't go through very many ups and downs that I noticed. Kind of more, they start up and then later on they take one or two steps down. But even that wasn't too dramatic. They don't have any like clearly worse albums. So Queen releases their first album in 1973, and I didn't know any songs from this album, and I really quite enjoyed this album. It was pretty straightforward rock, a little bit of the glam and operatic tones that they're known for, but not nearly what they would come into later. In this album, I feel like I heard a bit of influence from The Who in it, just in the sense of using very like positive sounding major chord progressions with a lot of energy backing it up. Now the second album was a really interesting one. It plays kind of like a rock opera in that you get the sense that this is a story-driven album. It's very fantasy-centric. A lot of stories about like kings and queens and trolls and things like that. According to Wikipedia, there's no one story that unites this whole album. They were just trying to go in a little bit more of a proggy direction. I liked this album a little bit more than the first album, but I got the sense that a lot of people liked this album a little bit less than the first album. Overall, they're still coming into the sound that would dominate the radio and the sound that everyone knew them for. But I thought several good songs from this one. Seven Seas of Rye was a great one. Their sound is already known for being so dramatic, so it lent itself pretty well to the kind of proggy, fantasy-driven concept that they were going for with Queen 2. Their third album, Sheer Heart Attack, is where I really think they start coming into their own. They capture their very dramatic and operatic sound, and they apply it to a little bit more of a straightforward rock instrumentation, and lyrically they tone it down a little bit too. They're singing about things that a lot of other rock bands sing about, like women and romance and everyday things, but they're combining it with their very grand operatic vocals. This is the first album where I started recognizing some songs. The songs were Killer Queen and Stone Cold Crazy. And though I thought pretty much every song from this album was good, I still think those were the best ones. It's clear to see why those were the hits. They're really continuing their upward momentum with their next album, A Night at the Opera, which a lot of people consider to be their best album. I actually think it's their best album. We all know Bohemian Rhapsody and You're My Best Friend, which is on this album. But the Prophet song really stood out to me as one of their best overall deep cuts. And then also from this album, 39 and I'm in Love with My Car were other deep cut standouts to me. A Day at the Races comes up next, which is a pretty solid album, although it is my least favorite album that I have heard so far. Only knew one song from here, which was Somebody to Love. But there were a couple other songs that I liked, like Tie Your Mother Down was one. And then Long Away was the other deep cut that I liked from this album. This doesn't mean they're off of their career upswing, though, because next they have News of the World, which is their other best album. And this album was also just incredible. It's about as good as A Night of the Opera to me. And this album opens with We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions, which are some of Queen's most widely recognized songs. They're so ingrained in my mind, and I'm sure everyone else's mind, that it was a little hard to approach these songs from a more objective perspective, just because I have so much history hearing these songs everywhere. The whole rest of the album is really good. But the song Sheer Heart Attack shows up on this one. Spread Your Wings shows up on this album as well, both of which I really liked. And then the other song, which ends up being another one of my absolute favorite Queen songs, is It's Late. It's Late is amazing. It stood out to me like the Prophet song from A Night at the Opera, as being my favorite deep cuts that I've heard so far. They have Jazz, which comes out next, which I also thought was amazing. From some things that I've read online, it seems like this might not be some people's favorites, that it might fall lower on their lists, but to me, this was just another one of my favorites, right up there with most of the albums that I've been hearing so far. After this is where, if you're going to consider Queen to have any sort of downturn in their career, this is about where it starts happening. Their next album, The Game, seems to be well loved by many people. I had noticed that it was a little bit of a downgrade, and it's my least favorite album now that I have heard up until this point. This album brings it a little bit less on the deep cuts, and so Another One Bites the Dust, it just ends up being the kind of main highlight. So The Game was released in 1980. Also in 1980 is when they do the soundtrack to Flash Gordon, which I have actually seen the movie before. The album is pretty much a soundtrack. It really only has 2 real songs on it, one of which is a variation of the main theme of the movie, which shows up in a few songs. And the other one is The Hero. That was a pretty good song. Everything else is just kind of background noise. Then they released Hot Space, which was another one of my least favorite Queen albums. It has Under Pressure on it, which is a very well-loved and recognizable hit. The rest of the album is more or less a dance pop album. They had released Another One Bites the Dust a couple years earlier, and that was such a big hit that it drives them into trying to get more into a dance pop direction. The next album, The Works, is really an amalgamation of a lot of different sounds. They everything that's inspired them up to this point, they bring into this album. And I thought this album got off to a pretty slow start. Radio Gaga, which is kind of a minor hit of theirs, is the first song on this album, which I didn't actually super love. The second half of the album really brings it, though, with I Wanna Break Free, Keep Passing the Open Windows, and Hammer to Fall, all amazing songs. They released A Kind of Magic next in 1986, which was a pretty good album. We're still a couple steps down from their heyday, but this album had a few songs that were decent takeaways. I liked the first song, One Vision. Really, where this album wins is the ballad Who Wants to Live Forever. I thought this album this song was so beautiful, and definitely my favorite from this one. Also one that I was unfamiliar with up until now. They released The Miracle in 1989. This was another meh album to me, comparatively to the rest of Queen's discography. It has I Want It All on it, which I was somewhat familiar with that song. Khashoggi's Ship was a more deeper cut from this album that I ended up really liking. Thankfully, though, with the one chance they have to really bring it back, they absolutely do. So they released Innuendo in 1991, and Freddie Mercury is getting pretty sick at this point. But this album was so good. I thought it's clear that their songwriting is maturing quite a bit. I thought the title track was one of the best songs they had done up until this point. Lots of really good songs, though, here, like Headlong and Ride the Wild Wind. But yeah, Innuendo, and then the second track, I'm blanking on its name right now, were also some major highlights. Shortly after releasing Innuendo, Freddie Mercury, greatest vocalist of our time, sadly passes away, courtesy of the U.S. president who purposefully ignored the AIDS crisis because he wanted all the gay people to die. After he passes, they release Made in Heaven, which is just reworking or using vocal tracks that he recorded that were unreleased, and then they wrote the songs around that later. I think this is a great album for very dedicated Queen fans. Not a great album overall, though. It was paradoxically shallow and deep. It portrayed really one emotion throughout the whole thing, and there just weren't really much variations aside from that. There's my album ranking, by the way. I did listen to The Cosmos Rocks, their album with Paul Rodgers. Didn't think it was amazing. The title track was all right. Paul Rodgers, just his voice, I think, is too down to earth for it to make it really work with Queen. The top two are 10 out of 10. Everything from Jazz to Innuendo is like 7, 8, 9 out of 10. And descends from there. Thank you for watching.